Close your eyes and imagine a place where humanity goes to die, where the concepts of mercy and dignity and individual worth are systematically dismantled through engineered starvation and forced labor, and the casual brutality of guards who have been trained to see prisoners not as people, but as numbers, as units of labor to be exploited until they break, and then replaced with fresh numbers from the endless supply of arrests that feed the machinery of totalitarian control. Auschwitz in 1944 is not a prison in any conventional sense. It is a factory for death, an industrial operation designed to extract every possible calorie of work from human bodies before disposing of them in crematoria that run 24 hours a day, that fill the sky with smoke and ash and the smell that survivors will recognize for the rest of their lives, even when they encounter it in completely innocent contexts decades later. Your name is Viktor Frankl. You are 39 years old, a Viennese psychiatrist and neurologist, a man who spent the pre-war years developing therapeutic approaches to depression and existential crisis, who wrote about meaning and purpose and the human need for significance, who believed that people could endure almost any suffering if they could find reason for that suffering, if they could connect their pain to some larger framework that made endurance worthwhile. Now, you are testing that theory under conditions you never imagined, under circumstances that seem designed specifically to destroy meaning, to reduce existence to the animal struggle for survival, where philosophy and purpose dissolve into the immediate necessities of obtaining extra rations or avoiding the selection that sends prisoners to the gas chambers. You arrived at Auschwitz in September 1944, transported from Theresienstadt concentration camp with your wife, Tilly, and your mother and brother, all of you understanding what selection meant when you stepped off the train onto the platform where SS doctors stood making decisions with pointing fingers. Left to labor camp, right to immediate death. Your mother went right. You saw her disappear into the group that was herded toward the gas chambers, saw the last moment you would ever see her alive, though you did not know yet about the gas chambers, did not understand that right meant death within hours, that the elderly and children and anyone deemed unable to work were simply eliminated upon arrival as inefficient mouths to feed when the camp's purpose was extracting labor, not sustaining life. Tilly went left, as did you and your brother. Separated immediately by gender, you lost sight of her, lost any ability to protect her or even know her fate, lost everything except the memory of her face and the wedding band they confiscated during processing, along with every other possession, every photograph, every physical object that connected you to the life you lived before the number was tattooed on your arm and you became prisoner rather than person, became labor unit rather than Dr. Viktor Frankl, noted psychiatrist with published works and professional reputation and all the markers of civilized identity that meant nothing in a place where your value was measured entirely by how many hours of work could be extracted from your body before it failed. The camp physician who conducted your initial medical screening was a man named Josef Mengele. You did not know his name then, did not know that he was the angel of death who conducted experiments on twins and dwarfs and anyone whose unusual characteristics interested him, who sent thousands to gas chambers with casual gestures while maintaining the demeanor of scientist conducting research rather than mass murderer facilitating genocide. He looked at you with the clinical detachment of someone assessing livestock, noted your age and physique, made the calculation about whether you could work or should be eliminated immediately. Something in his assessment, Perhaps your relative health, despite months in Theresienstadt, perhaps simple luck, sent you to the labor barracks rather than the gas chambers. You survived Auschwitz through combination of chance and adaptation and the psychological resilience you had spent your career studying, discovering that your theories about meaning sustaining suffering were accurate, that prisoners who found purpose in caring for others, in maintaining dignity despite degradation, in believing their survival served some larger goal, endured better than those who focused only on the physical struggle, who reduced existence to calories consumed and labor performed, and the daily gamble of avoiding selection when the camp's purpose was extracting labor, not sustaining life. Your wife died in Bergen-Belsen. You learned this after liberation in May 1945, learned that she survived Auschwitz only to die of typhus in another camp weeks before British forces arrived and ended the nightmare. Your brother died in a sub-camp of Dachau. Your mother died in the gas chambers within hours of arrival. Of your immediate family, only you survived. Only you emerged from the camps alive to carry the weight of their deaths and the knowledge that your survival was arbitrary, was not earned through superior virtue or strength or deserving, but simply the result of random factors, the particular doctor who conducted your selection, the day you arrived, the labor shortages that made your medical skills valuable when they could have easily been deemed irrelevant. The liberation brought freedom, but not peace. You returned to Vienna in August 1945, found your apartment occupied by strangers, your possessions looted or destroyed, your professional practice dissolved, your entire pre-war life erased as completely as the regime had erased millions of lives through systematic murder. You had nothing except the psychological insights you had developed during imprisonment, the observations about how humans find meaning in suffering that you had tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and found, not disproven exactly, but complicated, made ambiguous by the reality that some suffering destroys meaning rather than creating it, that some circumstances are so degrading that maintaining dignity requires superhuman effort most people cannot sustain. You wrote a book about your experiences, not immediately. You needed time to process, to transform raw trauma into analyzed experience, to find the framework that would allow discussion of the camps without either minimizing their horror or being overwhelmed by it. The book, Man's Search for Meaning, was published in 1946, written in 9 consecutive days of fevered productivity, pouring onto pages everything you had learned about human nature and suffering and the ways people find purpose even in circumstances designed to destroy purpose. The argument believed that meaning can be found in 3 ways: through creating work or doing deeds, through experiencing something or encountering someone, and through the attitude one takes toward unavoidable suffering. The reception was mixed. Some readers found it profound, life-changing, evidence that even the Holocaust could produce insights about human resilience and the capacity to transcend circumstances through will and psychological framework. Others found it offensive, felt extracting philosophical lessons from genocide minimized the evil, turned mass murder into teaching opportunity, suggested that victims bore some responsibility for their own suffering if they failed to find meaning in it. You wrestled with this criticism, understood it came from a legitimate place, from people who believed the camps should produce only rage and grief and demands for justice rather than philosophical reflections on meaning and purpose. But you also believed that allowing the camps to destroy your capacity for finding meaning would be giving Hitler a posthumous victory, would be letting the machinery of death accomplish its goal even after that machinery had been dismantled and its architects executed or imprisoned.
The years accumulated. You rebuilt your practice, remarried, had a daughter, became internationally recognized authority on existential psychology and the therapeutic approaches that helped people find meaning in their lives. But always in the background was Auschwitz, was the memory of the camps and the people who died there, and the arbitrary nature of your survival. You spoke about the camps when asked, participated in educational programs and commemorations, testified at trials of camp personnel when prosecutors needed survivors to provide evidence about conditions and atrocities. And through this work, through the documentation and testimony and the slow process of historical accounting, you learned the name of the doctor who selected you for labor rather than immediate death. Josef Mengele had escaped after the war, fled to South America where he lived in hiding, protected by a network of Nazi sympathizers and the simple difficulty of finding one man in a continent that offered countless places to disappear. He died. The years accumulated. You rebuilt your practice, remarried, had a daughter, became internationally recognized authority on existential psychology and the therapeutic approaches that helped people find meaning in their lives. But always in the background was Auschwitz, was the memory of the camps and the people who died there, and the arbitrary nature of your survival. You spoke about the camps when asked, participated in educational programs and commemorations, testified at trials of camp personnel when prosecutors needed survivors to provide evidence about conditions and atrocities. And through this work, through the documentation and testimony and the slow process of historical accounting, you learned the name of the doctor who selected you for labor rather than immediate death. Josef Mengele had escaped after the war, fled to South America where he lived in hiding, protected by a network of Nazi sympathizers and the simple difficulty of finding one man in a continent that offered countless places to disappear. He died in 1979 without facing justice, drowned while swimming off Brazilian coast, his body unidentified for years. But there was another doctor, a man named Hans Munch. Hans Munch was 30 years old in 1943 when he was assigned to Auschwitz as SS physician, posted to the Hygiene Institute, where his official duties involved bacteriological research and water quality analysis, tasks that kept him at bureaucratic distance from the selections and gas chambers and the daily machinery of mass murder that other camp doctors participated in directly. But distance in Auschwitz was relative, illusory. No one worked in the camp without being complicit in its purpose, without enabling through their technical expertise or administrative competence the smooth functioning of an institution designed for industrial-scale killing. Munch analyzed water to prevent typhus outbreaks that would reduce camp productivity, conducted research that contributed to SS understanding of disease vectors and prevention, performed medical duties that supported the overall system, even if he personally did not select prisoners for gas chambers or conduct experiments on living subjects. After liberation, after the camps were documented and the evidence compiled, and the trials began at Nuremberg and in national courts across Europe, Munch was arrested and charged as a war criminal, accused of participating in the machinery of genocide through his service at Auschwitz, regardless of the specific duties he performed. The trial was held in 1947 in Krakow, Poland, in a courthouse filled with survivors and prosecutors and judges who had seen the photographs and heard the testimony and understood what Auschwitz represented.
who struggled with the question of where to draw lines of individual culpability when the entire institution was criminal, when serving in any capacity meant enabling mass murder, even if individual defendants could point to specific actions they did not personally commit. Munch's defense was complicated. He did not deny serving at Auschwitz, did not claim ignorance of the gas chambers or the selections or the systematic killing that was the camp's primary function. But he testified that he refused to participate in selections, that he used his position to help prisoners when possible, that he sabotaged research projects by producing inaccurate results that made them scientifically worthless, that he maintained his humanity despite the circumstances by refusing to cross certain lines, even when crossing them would have been easier, would have advanced his career, would have been expected by superiors who measured medical officers by their ideological commitment as much as their technical competence. Several survivors testified on his behalf. You were not among them. You did not know Munch during your time at Auschwitz, had no direct experience of his actions or character, no basis for testimony beyond the general observation that some camp doctors were marginally less monstrous than others, that gradations of complicity existed even within an institution designed to eliminate moral distinctions. But other survivors spoke about Munch refusing to select prisoners for execution, about him providing extra medicine or food when he could do so without being caught, about small acts of mercy that risked punishment, but which he performed anyway, because maintaining some connection to his pre-war identity as physician required resisting even in ways that seemed futile or dangerous. The court acquitted him, not because he was innocent. Service at Auschwitz made innocence impossible, made every person who worked there complicit regardless of specific actions, but because the evidence suggested he resisted when resistance was possible, that he maintained moral boundaries when others did not, that he used his position to help rather than harm when the opportunities arose. The acquittal was controversial, criticized by survivors who believed all Auschwitz personnel should be held accountable, who saw the judgment as minimizing the camp's evil by suggesting individual doctors could serve there without becoming war criminals. Munch returned to Germany and attempted to rebuild his life, but the acquittal did not bring peace, did not resolve the question of his own complicity, did not erase the knowledge that he served at Auschwitz, even if he refused to participate in its worst atrocities. He became a physician in a small Bavarian town, treated patients, and tried to be the doctor he had trained to be before the war, before ideology and nationalism and the momentum of collective evil swept him into service at a place where medicine was perverted into its opposite, where healing was replaced by systematic destruction, where the Hippocratic Oath was violated hourly and the very concept of medical ethics became meaningless.
You learned about Munch's acquittal in 1947, when the trial was reported in newspapers covering war crimes proceedings. You felt a complicated mix of reactions: relief that not all camp doctors were monsters like Mengele, anger that anyone who served at Auschwitz could walk free when so many victims never would, curiosity about what kind of man could work in that environment without being entirely corrupted by it, whether such moral preservation was actually possible, or whether Munch was simply better at maintaining appearances, at convincing himself and others that small acts of mercy balanced participation in genocide. The years passed. The 1950s and 60s brought economic recovery to Europe, brought the gradual transformation of war devastation into prosperity, brought new generations who knew the Holocaust only as history rather than lived experience. You continued your therapeutic work,
continued writing and teaching about meaning and suffering and the ways humans transcend their circumstances. Your book found wider audiences, was translated into dozens of languages, became foundational text for existential psychology and the broader movement toward meaning-centered therapy. But you remained uncomfortable with some interpretations, with readers who took your message about finding meaning in suffering as justification for accepting injustice rather than fighting it, who used your survival and resilience as evidence that victims could always choose their responses and were therefore somehow responsible for their own suffering if they failed to maintain positive attitude. In 1995, 50 years after liberation, commemorative events were organized at Auschwitz. Survivors who were still alive, a dwindling group, aging rapidly, facing their own mortality and the knowledge that soon there would be no living witnesses, only recorded testimony and historical documentation, gathered to remember the dead, to honor those who did not survive, to testify once more about what happened so that memory would be preserved when direct experience was no longer possible. You attended, traveling from Vienna to Poland, walking through the camp that had been preserved as memorial and museum, seeing the barracks and watchtowers and crematoria that still stood as physical evidence of what occurred there. Hans Munch was also there, not as official participant, but as private pilgrim, coming to the place where his life changed, where his understanding of human nature and moral possibility was shattered by daily exposure to systematic evil and his own participation in it, however reluctant. He was 82 years old now, frail and using cane, accompanied by family members who had never fully understood what his father did during the war, what it meant to have served at Auschwitz even while claiming to have resisted its worst demands. Someone pointed him out to you. That is Hans Munch, the only Auschwitz doctor acquitted at trial. He comes here sometimes, says he needs to remember, needs to confront what he was part of, even though he was acquitted. You studied him from distance, this elderly man who looked like any grandfather, whose appearance gave no indication of his history, whose current gentleness offered no evidence of the choices he made during the war. You felt a surge of anger. What right did he have to be here, to participate in commemoration as though he were victim rather than perpetrator, as though his acquittal erased his complicity, as though working at Auschwitz could be forgiven because he claimed to have helped a few prisoners while enabling the murder of thousands? But you also felt curiosity. What would he say if confronted? How did he live with the knowledge of what he had been part of? Did he truly believe his resistance mattered, or was that rationalization, psychological defense against unbearable guilt? You decided to approach him, to have the conversation that decades of separation and your own reluctance to engage with former camp personnel had prevented. You cross the memorial grounds slowly, watching Munch as he stands before one of the barracks, his hand resting on the weathered wood, his expression unreadable, but suggesting something heavier than mere nostalgia or historical curiosity. This is not tourist examining artifact. This is man confronting his own past, standing in physical space where his choices mattered, where the decisions he made determined whether specific prisoners lived or died, whether he used his position to help or harm, or simply maintained the technical efficiency that allowed the system to function smoothly. You stop a few feet away, and he senses your presence, turns to face you with wariness that suggests he recognizes you are a survivor, can identify the numbers tattooed on your forearm, even though they are covered by your sleeve, can read in your posture and expression the weight of someone who was here when this place was functioning death camp rather than memorial. Dr. Munch, you say, using his title deliberately, forcing acknowledgement of the professional identity you share, the medical training that should have created obligation to heal, which he deployed in service to institution designed to kill. He nods, confirming his identity, and waits for whatever comes next, accusation, confrontation, the judgment that survivors have every right to deliver against anyone who worked here, regardless of their claimed resistance or post-war acquittal. My name is Viktor Frankl. I was a prisoner here in 1944. I survived. My wife, my mother, my brother, they did not, and I have questions for you. Munch's face shows pain that might be genuine or might be performance cultivated over 50 years of explaining himself, of defending choices made when he was a young doctor caught in a machinery larger than individual conscience, when refusing orders meant his own death or deportation to combat unit on the Eastern Front, where life expectancy was measured in weeks. I was assigned, Munch replied, and you see him brace for the response this answer always generates, the skepticism about claims of powerlessness from people who served a regime that depended entirely on millions of individuals choosing compliance over resistance. I could have refused, but refusal meant, I do not know what it meant, perhaps execution, perhaps nothing. I told myself assignment meant death, told myself I had no choice, but truthfully, I do not know. I was afraid, I wanted to survive, and I convinced myself I could serve without becoming a monster, could work at Auschwitz without participating in its essential evil. Could you? The question carries weight of 50 years, weight of your own survival, and the deaths you witnessed, and the knowledge that Munch's claimed resistance, his refusal to participate in selections, his small acts of mercy, did nothing to stop the machinery, did nothing to save the thousands who died while he worked safely in his laboratory, analyzing water and conducting research. No, Munch says, and the admission seems to cost him something, seems to be an answer he has arrived at through decades of self-examination rather than easy rationalization. You ask, why are you here, gesturing to the memorial grounds, at the preserved barracks and the information plaques and the visitors walking reverently through space that was once filled with suffering? Why come back to this place?
Because I cannot escape it anywhere else, Munch says, his voice rough with emotion that might be genuine grief or might be self-pity, impossible to distinguish without knowing his heart better than any conversation can reveal. I tried to forget, tried to build life in Bavaria where no one knew my history, where I was just local doctor treating ordinary ailments, but Auschwitz followed me. Every night I dreamed about it. Every patient reminded me of the ones I could not save here, the ones I did not try hard enough to save, because trying seemed futile and dangerous. I come here because this is where the truth lives, where I cannot pretend I was just following orders, or that my resistance mattered more than my compliance. You stand in silence, processing this confession, trying to decide whether it changes anything, whether Munch's acknowledgement of guilt constitutes sufficient penance for participation in genocide, whether anything could constitute sufficient penance for that level of complicity. The anger you felt approaching him has not disappeared, but has become more complicated, has been joined by something that might be recognition of shared humanity, might be the understanding that evil is often perpetrated by ordinary people who convince themselves they have no choice, who make series of small compromises that accumulate into catastrophic moral failure.
I hated all of you, you say finally, meaning the doctors, the guards, the administrators, everyone who worked at Auschwitz and made the machinery of death function smoothly. I hated you for being comfortable while we starved, for being safe while we died, for having choices while we had none. And I hated that some of you survived the war and went home to your families, while my wife and mother and brother died here, and I went home to nothing. Munch nods, accepting this, offering no defense against hatred that is earned and justified. You have right to that hatred. You have right to never forgive, to carry that anger until you die. Nothing I did or failed to do erases what happened here, what I was part of. But you realize, standing in this place 50 years after liberation, that carrying hatred requires energy you no longer possess, requires maintaining emotional intensity that exhausts rather than sustains you. You have spent decades teaching that meaning can be found even in suffering, that humans can transcend their circumstances through the attitudes they choose, that forgiveness is sometimes path to freedom rather than capitulation. And now you are faced with the test of your own philosophy. Can you forgive the unforgivable? Can you extend mercy to someone who enabled your torture, even if he claims to have resisted its worst manifestations? I do not forgive what happened here, you say carefully, drawing distinction that feels important. I do not forgive Auschwitz or the regime that created it, or the systematic murder of millions. That is beyond my authority to forgive, is crime against humanity rather than crime against individual. But you, perhaps I can forgive you for being human, for being weak, for making choices under pressure I hope I never face, for trying to maintain decency in circumstances designed to destroy decency, even if that attempt was insufficient. Munch's eyes fill with tears that he does not bother to hide, that run down weathered face unchecked, and you understand that whatever else he is, war criminal, perpetrator, man who served at Auschwitz, he is also someone who has carried the weight of that service for 50 years, who has tried to atone through testimony and education, and returning to this place to confront his complicity, rather than hiding from it. I do not deserve your forgiveness, he says, voice breaking. I do not deserve anything except the judgment that I escaped through legal technicality, through testimony from prisoners I helped, when helping cost me nothing, when real resistance would have meant refusing to serve here at all, regardless of consequences. Perhaps, you acknowledge, because false reassurance would be dishonest, would minimize the seriousness of his choices and their consequences. But I am not offering forgiveness to give you peace. I am offering it to give myself peace, to stop carrying hatred that poisons me more than it punishes you, to choose meaning over bitterness, even when bitterness seems more justified. The distinction matters to you, keeps the forgiveness from feeling like betrayal of those who died, like a suggestion that their suffering can be erased through reconciliation between survivor and perpetrator. You walk through the camp together, a strange pilgrimage that draws attention from other visitors who recognize the dynamic, elderly survivor and elderly German, obviously engaged in conversation weighted with history, obviously processing something that transcends tourism or historical curiosity. Munch tells you about his life after the war, about the nightmares that never stopped, about the patients he treated while carrying knowledge that he once served institution dedicated to destroying rather than healing, about the moral complexity of being acquitted by court while knowing in his heart that he was guilty of something, even if that something did not meet legal definition of war crimes. I want to ask you something, Munch says, as you approach the ruins of one of the gas chambers, destroyed by retreating SS, but still recognizable, still standing as evidence of what happened here. I want to write a statement, a formal declaration about what I witnessed at Auschwitz, about the gas chambers and the selections and the systematic murder. I want to testify in a way that cannot be dismissed as coerced or biased, want my acquittal to give weight to my testimony, because deniers claim survivors exaggerate or that confessions were extracted through torture. Would you be willing to witness this statement, to add your testimony to mine so that the record is clear, so that no one can claim the gas chambers were a fabrication or that what happened here was anything less than industrial genocide?
I will do it, you say, making a decision that feels both right and uncomfortable, that serves historical truth while requiring you to stand publicly beside man who served at Auschwitz, who was part of the machinery that killed your family, even if he claims to have resisted that machinery's worst demands. But on one condition: the statement must be complete. You cannot minimize or excuse or claim ignorance of what you knew. The testimony must serve truth, not your reputation or peace of mind. Munch agrees immediately, and over the following weeks you work together on the declaration, meeting in Vienna and Munich to draft and revise the document that will become his formal testimony. The process is painful, requires him to describe in detail what he witnessed, the selections at the ramp, the gas chambers operation, the cremation of bodies, the systematic dehumanization of prisoners, the medical experiments conducted by Mengele and others, the complete absence of any genuine medical ethics or regard for human life. You witness his signature, add your own testimony about conditions in the camp, about the starvation and disease and arbitrary violence, about watching people die and being unable to help because help was impossible in system designed to extract maximum labor before death. The declaration is published in 1995, receives international attention, is used in educational programs and legal proceedings, and as evidence against Holocaust deniers who claim the gas chambers never existed or that deaths were from disease rather than systematic murder. Munch's testimony, corroborated by yours and by documentation and by physical evidence, becomes important contribution to historical record, proof that even perpetrators acknowledge what happened, that denial requires ignoring not just victims' accounts, but confessions from those who participated. The collaboration transforms your relationship. You are not friends exactly. Friendship seems inappropriate between survivor and perpetrator, seems to minimize the gravity of what happened and the fundamental inequality of your positions. But you develop something else, some form of connection built on shared commitment to preserving truth, on mutual recognition of the importance of testimony, on the strange bond between two men who experienced the same place from radically different positions, but who both emerged carrying weight that requires acknowledgement, requires witness, requires speaking, even when speaking is painful. Munch dies in 1995, having spent his final years speaking at schools and museums and commemorative events about his service at Auschwitz and his failure to resist adequately, about the ease with which ordinary people become complicit in evil, when complicity is normalized, when institutional structures make resistance seem impossible or futile. His obituaries are complicated,
cannot easily categorize him as hero or villain, must acknowledge both his acquittal and his complicity, both his post-war testimony and his wartime service. You speak at his funeral, a decision that draws criticism from some survivors and family members who believe you are honoring perpetrator, who see your presence as endorsement of Munch's claim that he resisted when he should be remembered only as someone who served at Auschwitz, regardless of claimed limitations to that service. But you speak anyway, because you believe the truth is complicated, because you want to testify that forgiveness is possible without forgetting, that acknowledging someone's humanity does not erase their crimes, that the choice to extend mercy serves the forgiver as much as the forgiven.
You die in 1997 at age 92, 2 years before Munch, having outlived most of your generation, having survived long enough to see your work on meaning and suffering become foundational text for existential therapy, to see your message about finding purpose even in the worst circumstances reach millions of readers across dozens of languages and cultural contexts. But you die before the full impact of your collaboration with Munch becomes clear, before the declaration you witnessed together becomes standard reference in Holocaust education, before deniers are forced to confront testimony from a perpetrator whose acquittal makes him inconvenient witness they cannot easily dismiss as coerced or biased. Your final years are spent grappling with the question that defined your post-war life, whether extracting meaning from Auschwitz honors the dead or exploits them, whether your survival obligated you to testify about resilience and transcendence, or whether such testimony minimizes the evil, suggests victims could have chosen different responses, places burden on sufferers to find purpose in their suffering, rather than on perpetrators to stop inflicting it. You never fully resolve this tension, never arrive at a comfortable answer that erases the ambiguity, but you continue teaching that meaning is possible even in extreme suffering, that humans possess capacity to transcend their circumstances through the attitudes they choose, that forgiveness is sometimes a path to freedom rather than capitulation to evil. The forgiveness you extended to Munch remained controversial throughout your life and beyond. Survivor organizations debated whether your collaboration legitimized the perpetrator, whether standing beside former SS doctor betrayed those who died, whether forgiveness was yours to offer when the crimes were against humanity rather than merely against individuals. Some survivors refused to speak to you after the declaration was published, felt you had crossed a line that should remain inviolable, that no amount of claimed resistance or post-war testimony justified treating Auschwitz doctor as partner in preserving historical truth, rather than as a criminal who escaped full accountability through legal technicality. But others understood what you were attempting, the difficult work of acknowledging that evil is often perpetrated by ordinary people who convince themselves they have no choice, that complicity exists in gradations even within institutions designed for systematic murder, that the capacity for both good and evil coexist in human nature, and sometimes in a single individual whose choices shift
between resistance and compliance depending on circumstances and courage and the particular moral test they face in any given moment. Munch was not Mengele, was not architect of genocide or enthusiastic participant in medical experiments or someone who found satisfaction in cruelty. But he was also not innocent, was not hero, was someone who served at Auschwitz and enabled its function even while claiming to resist its worst demands. Your collaboration with him was not endorsement of his service, but acknowledgement of the importance of his testimony, recognition that historical truth benefits from perpetrator confessions, even when those confessions come from people whose moral accounting remains complicated, whose claims of resistance may be exaggerated or self-serving, but whose core testimony about what happened is valuable regardless of their motivations for providing it. The declaration you witnessed together stands as evidence not just of Holocaust's reality, but of the possibility that perpetrators can confront their complicity, can testify truthfully even when truth implicates them, can choose to serve historical accuracy over self-protection. The friendship that developed between you, and it did become friendship over the years between 1995 and 1997, became a relationship that transcended the witness-perpetrator dynamic and approached genuine connection built on shared commitment to truth and mutual respect despite the unbridgeable difference in your wartime experiences. That friendship demonstrated something important about human capacity for change, for growth, for the possibility that people can transcend their worst choices without erasing them, can acknowledge evil they participated in, while still being treated as human beings capable of redemption, or at least of useful service to historical memory. But the friendship also demonstrated the cost of such transcendence. You lost relationships with survivors who could not accept your collaboration with Munch, who saw your forgiveness as betrayal, who believed that maintaining absolute moral clarity about perpetrators was more important than acknowledging gradations of complicity or extracting value from their testimony. You accepted this cost because you believed the alternative, refusing all contact with perpetrators, maintaining pure separation between victims and those who enabled their victimization, would impoverish historical record and our understanding of how ordinary people become complicit in evil, would sacrifice truth to emotional satisfaction of condemning without listening.
And Munch paid his own costs. His family struggled with his past, with knowledge that their father served at Auschwitz, with the complicated legacy of his acquittal and his subsequent testimony, with the way his claimed resistance was viewed skeptically by many survivors and historians who believed he exaggerated his moral courage to rationalize service he should have refused, regardless of personal consequences. His collaboration with you brought renewed attention to his wartime service, brought fresh scrutiny that was painful even when it acknowledged his post-war efforts to testify truthfully about what he witnessed. The question that survives both of you is whether the collaboration was worthwhile, whether the declaration you produced together and the friendship you developed justified the costs both of you paid, whether forgiveness between victim and perpetrator serves historical understanding or obscures the moral clarity that genocide demands.
There are no simple answers, no formulas that resolve the tension between acknowledging human complexity and maintaining accountability for systematic evil, between extracting meaning from suffering and refusing to let that meaning minimize the criminality of those who inflicted the suffering. What remains is the testimony itself, yours about finding meaning even in Auschwitz, his about serving there while claiming to resist, both of you attempting to preserve truth for generations who will know the Holocaust only as history rather than lived experience, who will need evidence and testimony and the complicated witness of people who were there in different capacities, whose accounts overlap and contradict, and together create portrait of human behavior under extreme conditions that resists simplification, that demands we see both the worst and the occasionally better impulses that coexisted even in places designed to eliminate human decency. The memorial at Auschwitz now includes both your stories, yours as survivor who found meaning in suffering and went on to teach millions about resilience and purpose, his as perpetrator who claimed resistance and spent his post-war life testifying about what he witnessed, whose collaboration with you demonstrated that even the unbridgeable gap between victim and perpetrator can sometimes be crossed not through forgetting, but through shared commitment to truth and the possibility that forgiveness serves those who offer it as much as those who receive it.